The most impossible rise of a city ever, Perth, Western Australia. On the western edge of a continent cut off from every other city by nearly 2,000 kilometres of open desert, sits a place that is closer to Jakarta than to Sydney. It is widely regarded as the most isolated major city on Earth, closer to Dili in another country than to the next Australian capital, closer to the islands of Southeast Asia than to the eastern coast of its own nation, reachable overland only by crossing the Nullarbor, a treeless plain traversed by the longest straight stretch of road anywhere on the planet. Perth should never have held. It began not as a prison but as a free colony, settled by private citizens who had paid their own way to the far side of the world, and within a generation that free colony had come so close to starving that it turned and begged Britain for the convicts it had been founded to do without. And yet it stands today among the wealthiest cities in the country, enriched not once but twice by what lies buried beneath the desert that isolates it. This is the story of the most improbable rise of any city in the world. Chapter 1. The loneliest city. Distance is the first fact about Perth, and every other fact bends around it. From the towers on the Swan River to the next Australian capital at Adelaide is more than 2,100 kilometres by air and closer to 2,500 by road, an expanse of dry country that a traveller crosses for days without arriving anywhere that could be called a city. To the east lies the Nullarbor, a limestone plain so flat and so bare that its name was built to say, in plain Latin, that no tree grows on it. Along its southern edge runs a single sealed road that holds one heading for 146 kilometres without a curve, the longest straight road on Earth, laid across a landscape that offers a driver nothing to steer toward. To the west there is only ocean, uninterrupted to the coast of Africa. Perth does not sit at the edge of a country. It sits at the edge of the habitable world, and it looks outward across water. The numbers that measure that isolation point almost mockingly away from the nation Perth belongs to. The city lies nearer to Dili, the capital of another country, than to Sydney. It lies nearer to Jakarta, across the Indian Ocean and the Indonesian archipelago, than to the eastern seaboard of its own continent. A merchant standing on the Perth waterfront in any century has always been closer, in kilometres, to the ports of Asia than to the markets of his own countrymen. No other city of its size on the planet is so far from the next one. The isolation is not a hardship the city overcame on its way to becoming what it is. It is the permanent condition inside which everything that follows had to happen. But the country at the mouth of the Swan River was not empty when the first European sails appeared off the coast, and it had not been empty for a very long time. The Whadjuk people of the Noongar nation had lived on this land for tens of thousands of years, through a span of time beside which the entire European history of the place is a single afternoon. They knew the river the newcomers would call the Swan by its own name, the Derbarl-Yerrigan, and they knew it not as a shipping channel but as the work and the dwelling place of the Waugal, the great water serpent of their creation, whose movement through the land had shaped the river, the wetlands and the springs. The seasons, the fish runs, the burning of the country to keep it open and feeding, all of it was held in a body of law and knowledge, carried across a depth of time the arriving settlers had no framework to comprehend. To the men who would sail up the Derbarl-Yerrigan in 1829, the country looked unclaimed. It was nothing of the kind. It had been continuously inhabited, named and governed for longer than the whole of recorded history, and the people who held that knowledge were still there, watching the ships come in. Chapter 2. The Free Colony. The ships came in the winter of 1829, and the man at the head of them was Captain James Stirling, a naval officer who had sailed up the Swan River 2 years earlier and returned to London convinced he had found the site of a future empire. What Stirling proposed, and what the Colonial Office reluctantly granted, was something new for the continent. Every British settlement in Australia to that point had been built on convict labour. Transported felons worked under the gun to raise the walls of a jail that was also a colony. The Swan River colony would be different. It would take no convicts. It would be settled by free men and women who paid their own passage and were granted land in proportion to the capital and the labour they brought with them. It was to be the first free settler colony in Australia. an experiment in building a British society in the antipodes without the stain of the chain gang. The whole venture rested on a single unexamined assumption, which was that free hope, properly capitalized, would be enough. The founding itself was a small ceremony performed with an axe. In August of 1829, on rising ground above the river, some 19 kilometres upstream from the coast, the site of the capital was marked in the plainest way available to a party with no stone and no time. Mrs. Helen Dance, the wife of one of the officers, cut into a tree with an axe, and the town was declared to stand. There was no cornerstone, no monument, only a wound in the bark of a single tree and the authority of the men standing around it. They named the place Perth, after the town in Scotland, a gesture toward a homeland 18,000 kilometres away, made on a riverbank that had carried a different name for tens of thousands of years. At the mouth of the river, where the ships had to anchor and unload, they laid out a port and called it Fremantle. The arrangement was simple and hopeful. Fremantle would be the harbour, Perth the seat of government upriver, and the free settlers would spread out across the granted land and make it pay. They arrived believing they had come to a country that would reward them for showing up. Ships stood off Fremantle through 1829 and into 1830, unloading families, servants, ploughs, seed, furniture, and in at least one recorded case, a carriage, onto open sand with no wharf to receive them and no warehouse to store them. Settlers of means had been promised land by the acre against the value they imported, and some had brought the contents of entire English households to a shore where there was nowhere yet to put any of it. Goods sat spoiling in the weather at the water's edge. The land grants, generous on paper, scattered the colonists thinly across country none of them had seen and few could reach. For a season the mood held, buoyed by the sheer novelty of a colony that owed its existence to no convicts' labour, a place a free man could arrive in and call his own from the first day. The hope was real, and it was widely shared, and it did not survive contact with the ground. Chapter 3. The colony that nearly failed. The trouble was the soil. Beyond the immediate green of the river flats, the country the settlers had been granted was sand, a pale, thin coastal sand that held neither water nor nutrient, and gave back almost nothing to men who had come expecting English fields. The grants that had looked so generous on the map turned out to be, in many cases, expanses of scrub and dune that would not repay the labour of clearing them. And clearing was the second trouble. The bush had to be taken out by hand, tree by tree, and root by root, in heat the newcomers were not built for, and there were nowhere near enough hands to do it. The whole design of the colony had assumed that capital would summon labour, that gentlemen with land grants would command the servants and workers to make those grants productive. Instead, the labourers, once ashore and free, did the arithmetic themselves and walked away to take up land of their own or to leave the colony altogether. A landholder with 10,000 acres and no one to work them held nothing that could feed him. So the colony stalled almost as soon as it began. Free immigrants, the lifeblood the whole experiment depended upon, arrived in a trickle and departed nearly as fast, carrying word back to Britain and to the eastern colonies that the Swan River was a place where fortunes were lost rather than made. Some who had disembarked with high expectations reboarded within months for the older, surer settlements at Sydney or across the water at the new colony forming around Port Adelaide. Land that had been valued at $1 an acre or more in the first flush of settlement could not be given away a few years later. Capital that had crossed the world to build an estate sat idle for want of anyone to swing an axe. The population, instead of climbing as every projection had assumed, barely moved for 2 decades. A colony needs momentum, a sense that next year will be larger than this one, and Perth had none. For close to 20 years, the settlement hung on the edge of failure, too poor to attract the free labour it needed, and too remote for the wider world to notice or to care. It did not collapse outright. It did something in some ways more corrosive, which was to persist without growing, a scattering of struggling farms and a small stone town on a river at the far end of the earth, watching the eastern colonies fill with people and money while it stood still. By the end of the 1840s, the free experiment had been running for the better part of a generation and had proven, by every measure its own founders would have recognized, a failure. The colony that had been created to prove a free society could be built without convicts now faced a single humiliating question, and the answer would overturn the one principle on which it had been founded. Chapter 4. The colony that begged for convicts. The answer the colonists reached was the one they had crossed the world to avoid. If free labour would not come, and if the labour that came would not stay, then there remained only one source of workers a struggling colony could compel to remain and to build, and it was the source every other Australian settlement had been founded upon, and that this one had been founded to reject. The landholders of the Swan River, the same class of men who had arrived 2 decades earlier to prove that a British colony could rise without a chain gang, now petitioned London to send them convicts. It was a reversal so complete that it amounted to a confession. The free experiment could not sustain itself. The only way to save the colony that had been built to be free of convicts was to fill it with them. Britain, for its own reasons, was willing. The eastern colonies were by this time refusing further transportation, and the Empire still had prisoners it needed somewhere to put. In 1850, the first convict ship dropped anchor off Fremantle, and Western Australia formally became a penal colony, the last part of Australia to take up transportation just as the rest of the continent was casting it off. Over the 18 years that followed, from 1850 until transportation ended in 1868, close to 10,000 convicts were landed on the same shore that free settlers had walked onto with such hope 2 decades before. They came under sentence, they came under guard, and they came in numbers the free immigration had never once come close to matching. For the first time since its founding, the colony had all the hands it needed, because these hands could not choose to leave. And they built. The convicts and the ticket of leave men they became were put to the labour the free colony had never been able to command, and the physical shape of settled Western Australia is in large part their work. They cut and laid the roads that finally connected the scattered farms to the port and the capital. They built the bridges over the rivers and the culverts across the flats. They raised the public buildings the colony had gone 20 years without being able to afford, the barracks, the offices, the residences of government, and above all, the great limestone prison at Fremantle that they were compelled to build to hold themselves. The bones of the colony, the infrastructure without which no economy could function, were laid by men who had been sent there in irons. The free settlement did not save itself through the virtue it was founded on. It survived by importing, under sentence, exactly the thing it had been created to prove it did not need. The colony had been rescued, it had not yet been made rich, and nothing on that quiet, convict-built river suggested that within a single lifetime, the ground itself would give up a fortune. Chapter 5. The gold that saved it. For 60 years the colony had looked for a reason to exist, and it found one at last, not on the coast, but in the desert behind it. In 1892, 2 prospectors named Arthur Bailey and William Ford rode into a stretch of dry country some 500 kilometres east of Perth and pulled coarse gold out of the ground at a place the maps would come to call Coolgardie. The find was rich, and it was public, and it carried in a season across a continent already 3 years deep into a savage economic depression. Men who had lost work in the collapsed banks and shuttered mills of the eastern colonies had a direction to walk in now, and the direction was west. The greatest strike came the following winter. In June of 1893, an Irishman named Paddy Hannon, prospecting with 2 companions a little further east of Coolgardie, found gold lying almost at the surface, in country that would within months carry the name Kalgoorlie. What lay beneath Kalgoorlie was not a single reef, but a field, and at the heart of that field ran a stretch of ground so dense with ore that it acquired a name of its own. They called it the Golden Mile, reputed then and for long after the richest square mile of gold-bearing earth anywhere on earth. The men who had walked west to Coolgardie now walked the last stretch to Kalgoorlie, and the men behind them followed the same dust. The arithmetic of the colony changed with a speed its own officials struggled to record. In 1891, Perth had held somewhere near 8,400 people, a town in all but the most generous reading of the word. 10 years later, it held close to 27,000. It had tripled in a decade on the strength of a metal dug out of a desert 500 kilometres away, hauled and traded and banked through the port and the capital on the river. Western Australia as a whole did more than triple. A colony that in 1890 had counted barely 49,000 people counted, by the turn of the century, something near 180,000, quadrupled in 10 years by the same pull of the same gold. And the gold did not merely fill the colony, it carried it. By 1900, gold accounted for close to 9/10 of everything Western Australia sent out into the world, a proportion no wheat crop and no wool clip had ever come near supplying. The colony that had begged Britain for convicts to build its roads was now, on the ledger of its exports, one of the gold economies of the empire. The banks that had ignored it opened branches in it. The eastern colonies that had watched it stagnate for 50 years now sent it there unemployed by the thousand. The backwater had become a boomtown. It had a medal, a workforce, and a fortune moving through its port for the first time in its history. What it did not have, out on the fields where the gold actually lay, was water. Chapter 6. O'Connor's Pipeline. The goldfields had gold and almost nothing else. Kalgoorlie sat in country that received barely enough rain to wet the dust, with no permanent river within reach and no reliable water beneath the ground worth the sinking of a bore. The metal that was making the colony rich was being dug by men who paid for water by the gallon, carted across the desert at a price that rose with every dry month, in a settlement whose entire reason for existing could be ended by a single failed season. A field that could not water its workers could not hold them, and a colony that could not hold them would watch its one fortune walk back east the way it had come. The man who proposed to solve it was Charles Yelverton O'Connor, an Irish-born engineer who had come to Western Australia in 1891 to serve as its engineer-in-chief and had already given the colony the harbour works at Fremantle. What O'Connor put forward for the goldfields was a scheme of a scale that had no precedent anywhere. He would build a pipeline to carry fresh water more than 500 kilometres, from a dam and reservoir in the hills near Perth, across the whole width of the intervening desert, uphill the entire way, lifted by a chain of pumping stations against a rise of hundreds of metres to a reservoir above Kalgoorlie. Nothing of the kind had been attempted at that length. When it ran, it would be the longest freshwater pipeline in the world. The scheme was expensive and it was untried, and it made O'Connor a target. The press questioned the cost and the engineering in language that grew steadily less measured. Politicians who had backed the scheme found reasons to distance themselves from it. Newspapers ran allegations against his conduct and his competence, and pursued them and returned to them through the long years while the pipeline was still only pipe in the ground and could not yet answer for itself by working. O'Connor carried the whole of it, the technical burden and the public one together, through construction that stretched across the better part of a decade. On the 10th of March 1902, before the water had reached the goldfields, C.Y. O'Connor took his own life. He was found near the beach south of Fremantle, some 10 months before the scheme he had designed was proved. He did not see it run. The water reached Kalgoorlie in 1903. The pumps lifted it the full 500 kilometres and more, uphill across the desert, exactly as the plans had said they would, and the pipeline held, and the goldfields had their water. It ran, and it has kept running, carrying to the desert the one thing the desert could not supply. Built to the design of a man who was 10 months in his grave on the day it first arrived. Chapter 7. The Iron Under the Desert. The gold that saved Perth did not last forever, and in the ordinary course of a mining colony, the fortune would have thinned and the fields would have emptied, and the town on the river would have settled back toward the size its own coast could support. That is the arc that ended most boomtowns. It is not the arc that ended this one, because the ground around Perth held a second fortune far larger than the first, and it lay to the north. In the northwest of the state, in a stretch of ancient red country called the Pilbara, sits one of the greatest concentrations of iron ore anywhere on the planet. The reserves beneath it amount to something near 98% of all the iron ore in Australia, an ore body measured not against a state or a continent, but against the whole of the Earth's supply of the metal that makes steel. For most of the colony's history, it had been worthless, too remote to reach, too far from any port or furnace or market to justify the moving of it, locked in country that a federal government would for years forbid to be exported at all. That changed in 1966 when the first cargo of Pilbara iron ore was shipped out of the northwest. The tonnage that left in that first shipment was modest against everything that would follow, but it opened the trade. And the trade did not close. What had been unreachable red country became, over the decades after, the source of a share of the world's iron so large that the fortunes built on the gold fields of the 1890s would come to look small beside it. Gold had made Perth a city, it had tripled a town, quadrupled a colony, and carried both through the years when nothing else could. But gold was the smaller of the two fortunes hidden in the ground around it. The iron in the north would make Perth rich beyond anything the gold had ever promised. Chapter 8. The billion-tonne boom. The iron that Rio Tinto first shipped in 1966 did not stay one company's business for long. Beneath the Pilbara lay a concentration of ore so vast that no single firm could work more than a fraction of it. And within a generation, the ground had been divided among three. Rio Tinto held the ranges around Tom Price and Paraburdoo. The Broken Hill Proprietary Company, the same firm that had walked away from a desert silver seam half a century earlier and remade itself into a miner of everything, sank its own operations at Mount Whaleback and Newman. Between them, the two moved more ore out of the northwest of the continent than any two companies anywhere on Earth. The third came from nothing. In the early years of the new century, a Western Australian named Andrew Forrest, who had already run one mining venture into difficulty, began assembling leases in the Pilbara that the two established giants had passed over, and built around them a company he called Fortescue Metals. He had no mine, no railway, and no port. He built all three, laying his own track across hundreds of kilometres of red country to carry ore the majors said a newcomer could never move at a profit. Within a decade, Fortescue was shipping in the tens of millions of tonnes a year, and Forrest was among the wealthiest men in the country. Together, the three of them came to dig up close to 2/3 of all the iron ore traded across the world's oceans, almost all of it out of Western Australia. The country that bought most of it was China. Through the 2000s, its cities rose faster than any cities had ever risen, and every tower and every bridge and every kilometre of rail demanded steel, and steel demanded ore. The price answered the demand. Iron ore that had sold for roughly $13 a tonne in 2003 climbed over the years that followed to more than $180 by 2011, a rise steeper than any the commodity had recorded in its history. The wealth that came out of that climb was of an order the old goldfields had never approached. A hillside of ore that had been worth little when the ground was cheap became, at $180 a tonne, a fortune renewed with every shipload that left Port Hedland. The industry minted billionaires. Forrest was one. The men who ran and held the older companies were others. The royalties flowed to a state government that had never in its history handled sums of that size, and the mines themselves lay hundreds of kilometres from any city, in country too hot and too remote to build a city around. So the industry did not build one. It flew its workforce in and out instead. From the 1970s and 80s, a pattern had formed that the boom now carried to an enormous scale. Men and women boarded aircraft in Perth, flew north to Port Hedland and Newman and Tom Price, worked their rotations in the camps beside the pits, and flew home again when the shift cycle ended. The mines ran on shift work, and the aircraft ran on schedule, and the desert kept no permanent population it did not need. What the desert produced, Perth administered. The engineers, the geologists, the accountants, the lawyers, the head officers, and the trading floors sat 2,000 kilometres south of the ore they governed, in a city on the coast that dug nothing out of its own ground. The red dirt empire was run from a white-collar hub, and the hub grew rich on the running of it. Chapter 9. The richest state. The wealth did not stay in the Pilbara, and it did not stay only in the boardrooms of Perth. It reshaped the accounts of an entire state, and then the accounts of the nation that state belonged to. Western Australia holds barely 1/10 of Australia's people. On the map, it is enormous, 1/3 of the continent, But almost all of that expanse is desert, and almost all of its population sits in the one city on the southwestern coast. By the ordinary arithmetic of a federation, a place with a tenth of the people might expect to carry something near a tenth of the load. The ore inverted that arithmetic. By the middle of the 2020s, Western Australia was shipping close to half of the entire nation's merchandise exports, iron ore and gas and gold and the rest, out of ports that most Australians on the eastern seaboard would never see. The money the state took from it ran to sums that would once have been the whole national budget. Mining royalties alone, the fee the ore pays to the ground it comes from, exceeded $10 billion a year. While the older and more populous states on the eastern coast ran deficits, balancing schools against hospitals against roads on revenue that never quite stretched, Western Australia posted surpluses measured in billions, a surplus of some $3.7 billion in a single recent year, banked by a government that a century earlier had governed a colony too poor to keep its immigrants from leaving. Wealth on that scale did not go unnoticed by the rest of the Federation, and it did not go uncontested. The nation shares out a portion of its tax between the states, and the formula that shares it is built to send more to the states that need it and less to the states that do not. By that formula, a state as rich as Western Australia had become was entitled to only a thin slice of the pool, its own ore counting against it. For years, the state argued that the arrangement punished it for its success, that it was handing the proceeds of its ground to states that dug nothing comparable out of their own. The argument was bitter and it was long, and in time it won the state a larger and guaranteed share, an outcome the other states resented as a rich member of the Federation demanding still more. There was a caution buried in all of it, and the state knew the shape of the caution because it had lived the shape before. A place that earns close to half a nation's exports from a handful of commodities rises and falls with the price of those commodities. When the iron ore price is high, the surpluses are enormous. When it falls, as it had fallen before and would fall again, the same accounts that filled in a boom empty in a slump, and the state that had banked billions found how quickly the ground could stop paying. The gold had taught that lesson in the 1890s. The iron had only raised the stakes of it. Chapter 10. The Impossible City. Set the whole of it out in order, and the improbability is hard to overstate. A city was planted in the most isolated place on the continent, 2,000 kilometres of desert from the nearest neighbour. On the poor, sandy ground of a river, the Whadjuk people had held for tens of thousands of years. It was founded as a free colony, an experiment in settlement without chains, and the experiment very nearly died. Within 20 years, the colony that had been created to be free of convicts was begging Britain to send them, and it survived on the labour of the 10,000 who came. Then gold was found in the desert behind it, and the dying colony quadrupled in a decade. Then iron was found in the desert to the north, and the recovered colony became one of the wealthiest places in the country. Twice the ground beneath the desert reached up and saved a city that had no other reason to exist. Today, Perth is a city of more than 2 million people, one of the fastest growing capitals in the nation, more than a third of it born overseas, a coastal city facing the Indian Ocean, closer to Jakarta than to Sydney, run from glass towers that administer a wealth dug up 1,000 kilometres away. Stand on the south bank of the Swan River as the light goes at the end of a day. The towers of the central city rise on the far bank above the water, their glass catching the last of the sun, and then, as it drops, catching their own light instead. A wall of offices where the ore is traded and the royalties are counted, standing bright on the edge of the world with the whole empty width of the continent at its back. The river below is the Durbal Yerrigan, the water the Walgal is said to have made, older than any of it. Far to the north, across the Red Country, the same hour falls on the Pilbara. The great terraced pits step down into the earth in tiers wide enough to drive a road along, level below level, where the machines have taken the ore away one bench at a time and left the ground open behind them. Beside the pits, the airstrips run out flat into the scrub, and in the failing light the aircraft lift off them one after another, climbing over the desert with their cabins full of workers going home, south, toward the coast, toward the bright towers on the river, carrying nobody who will sleep the night beside the hole that pays them. Perth has been built twice on what lies under the ground, and both times the ground has answered when the city ran out of other reasons to survive. The gold ran to residue, and the diggers moved on. The iron is not gold, but it is finite in the same way, counted in the hundreds of millions of tons a year that leave the northern ports, drawn from ranges that are lower each season than the last. The plains will keep lifting off the red strips for as long as there is ore beneath them to justify the flight. What becomes of a city built twice on what lies under the ground on the day the ground has no more to give?